Hello, and welcome to Enchanted Rose Costumes. My name is Marika, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my construction process on my 1890s combinations. I hope you enjoy. The design of the combinations I made are greatly inspired by the 1890s combinations from the Met Museum. While mine are not a direct reproduction, they are my interpretation of the garment in question. To draft my drawers, I used the apportioning scales from the Voice of Fashion book in my waist size. I then printed them off to scale, and the pattern I used is the 1893 drawers from Authentic Victorian Fashion Patterns. Next, I cut out multiples of my rulers and carefully attached them together, making sure that the marks lined up correctly. Because the rulers only come in a short length, I combined multiples of them together to make one long ruler. This helped make the drafting process easier and quicker. To draft the drawers, I just followed the measurements from the book and transferred them to the paper. I started from point A and marked out all the horizontal lines and then added all the vertical lines afterwards. Once I had finished placing the marks, I then played connect the dots to get the outline of the pattern. Now, something I could see being a problem with this way of drafting is that there isn't a height measurement. The length of the pattern depends on the waist measurement, which could be a problem if, say, I was very tall and thin, or stout and short, but that's why we do mock-ups. Next, I moved on to draping the bodice. I began by making the style lines on my mannequin with a twill tape. Then, starting at the center front, I pinned the fabric onto my mannequin following the shape of the twill tape and cutting into the fabric to allow for shaping. I continued pinning and cutting and adjusting as needed until I was happy with the look of the bodice. I then used a Sharpie to mark important areas like the center back, center front, side seam, and the waistline. With everything marked, it was time to transfer it to paper. First, I trued up my side seams on the mock-up, and then using a tracing wheel, I copied the pattern onto the paper. Then I used my French curve and straight ruler for nice neat lines, labeling the pieces as I went. After transferring all the markings to the paper, I cut out the mock-up and made sure to add extra seam allowance for alterations. Next, I gathered the bodice and the drawers to a length of twill tape with the center front, center back, and side markings to test the fit. After the fitting, I made a few minor alterations and then took the mock-up apart, making sure to add notes as I went, such as gather size and placement, the center back fold, the strap length and placement, and balance points so I could line everything up again later. With my pattern ready to go, I started cutting everything out, beginning with my largest piece, the drawers. I think it was around this point that I started to miss how economical the 18th century was for cutting out fabric. I began sewing together the bodice with a simple French seam. This way all the raw edges would be neatly contained and I wouldn't have to worry about the fabric fraying. With both side seams sewn together, I then marked the lace placement on the wrong side of the fabric with my heat-sensitive pen. Because my fabric is quite drapey, I double-checked that my marks were even on both sides. And then on the right side of the fabric, I first pinned and then began basting my insertion lace with a quick running stitch. Moving over to the sewing machine, I sewed down the sides of my lace with a small stitch. I think it was set on a 2 at this point. Now my lace has a narrow channel that you can slightly see here, so I used that as my guide and sewed down the center of it. With both sides sewn, I then cut down the center of the fabric on the back of the lace, being very careful not to cut the lace itself. I then gently pressed the fabric open on a medium-low heat, taking care not to damage the lace. Then going over to my domestic machine, I stitched along the edge of the lace with a narrow zigzag stitch on the right side. My stitch width was 2.5 and the length was 0.5. I then very carefully trimmed away the excess fabric, taking great care not to cut the stitches or the right side of the fabric. I'm fairly certain this step would have been easier with the duckbill scissors. Next, I moved on to attaching the center front lace. I used the same techniques as before: pinning, basting, stitching, pressing, zigzagging, and trimming. For the lace on the upper edge of the bodice, I used my iron on a medium-low heat to press a curve into it to help ease it around the curves. And then repeated these same steps once again to attach the lace to the top of the bodice. Now I needed to add a small piece of lace to the top of one of the center front strips as I'd cut it too short. Thankfully, this lace doesn't fray and it was a simple fix. Piecing is period, ladies and gentlemen. Piecing is period. For a simple and clean finish at the center front, I attached the lace together by sewing a mitered corner. This way, the scalloped lace edge was continued all the way around. I love the look of mitered corners, they look so pretty. Once I had sewn the corner, I then trimmed away the raw edges. To help stabilize and provide some strength to the center front lace, I pinned a length of organza ribbon to the back side and carefully sewed all along the edges. Next, working from the wrong side of the fabric, I attached the lace straps to the bodice. Looking more closely at the original, it appears there is an underlayer that attaches to the strap, which I think would help make it stronger, but I realized that too late to add to my combinations, so instead I stitched the lace along the top and the bottom. Next, I sewed 2 gathering rows along the bottom of the bodice. And then with that done, I set the bodice aside to work on the drawers. For the lace insertion down the sides of the drawers, I used the same techniques yet again. Lace insertion is so beautiful, but it is also very time consuming. For the next part, I've added a diagram to help make things clearer. First, I hemmed the split drawer opening along the dashed lines. Now, if you look at the upper right portion of the pattern, you can see dashed lines on the outside of the pattern piece, and that is because I wish I had continued the pattern straight up to the top instead of notching it and having to add a placket afterwards. With both sides of the drawers pinned, I then sewed up the hems. I then sewed together the inner leg portion with a French seam as shown in the diagram. I then attached both legs together at the center front, once again using a French seam. For the opening at the top of the drawers, I decided to add a lapped placket. Now, I'm not going to talk much about it because after finishing the placket and the past couple steps, I realized I had sewed everything inside out. So I then had to completely undo everything and sew it the right way out. this time making sure that the finished lace edge was in fact on the outside. Now, because I had to redo it, I decided to also make my placket much narrower, as I found the 1-inch wide placket was much too bulky for how delicate the combinations were. In the end, the placket ended up being just under 1/2 inch wide. Moving on to the ruffle at the bottom of the drawers, I sewed together the ends with a French seam. And then repeated the steps with the lace. To attach the lace to the ruffle, I also sewed them together with a French seam, but I trimmed the seam allowance to a scant 1/8 of an inch and pressed the length of it meticulously so I could sew a very small French seam. I then gathered the upper edge of the ruffle with 2 gathering lines with a break at the halfway point. With the wrong sides of the fabric facing each other, I pinned the ruffles to the bottom of the drawers in quarters. I then gathered them evenly, stroking the gathers to help distribute the ruffles smoothly across the bottom of the drawers. And then I sewed the ruffle in place. Next, moving over to the ironing table, I pressed the seam from the inside of the combinations, using the side of my sleeve board to try not to flatten the gathers. I then carefully trimmed and graded the seam allowance. To cleanly finish the bottom edge of the drawers, I pinned a length of eyelet ribbon lace over the raw edge and sewed down both sides. I did come across a technique for inserting ruffles into a hem that I found interesting on page 7 of Authentic Victorian Dressmaking Techniques, but I decided to go with the method shown here as it was significantly quicker, although I will link that technique below. Next, using the smallest clover loop pressing bar as a large bodkin, I wove a ribbon through the trim starting at the outer side seam. After going all the way around, I then tied off the ribbon in a bow. I gathered the top of the drawers with 2 rows of a simple running stitch. I decided to gather them by hand as it gave me a different look compared to gathering them by machine, since the stitches are slightly farther apart. Next, with the wrong sides together, I pinned my drawers to the waistband, making sure I had all the balance points lined up correctly. I then gathered it to fit the waistband and carefully stroked the gathers and pinned everything in place. And then I stitched it together. Next, with the wrong sides together, I lined up my balance points along the bottom of the bodice and gathered it to fit the waistband. And once again, I stroked the gathers to evenly spread the material. Next, I carefully graded the seam allowance along the waistband, and then pinned the eyelet ribbon lace over the waistband to cover the raw edges, tucking under the raw edges of the trim at the ends. And then I carefully stitched along the sides of the trim yet again. And using the pressing bar again, wove the ribbon through the eyelet trim of the waistband. And it is finally time for the closures. I sewed on 8 tiny buttons down the center front of the combinations, and on the opposite side of the opening I hand stitched button loops. Now there are 2 different methods to make button loops, and the one I went with is a slip knot thread chain. First, the thread is anchored to the garment, and then the thread is slip knotted to the length needed to go around the button. Once it is to the desired length, the knot is tied off, and then that is secured back to the garment to make a loop. It is very simple to do, and if the thread does break, it is very easy to fix. And just like that, my 1890s combinations are complete. To quote the History of Undergarments, combinations with frills at the neck and the knee provided a pleasing prospect for those fortunate enough to see them, and I completely agree. If you want to see more frilly Victorian undergarments, I definitely recommend you head over to Bernadette Banner's channel and watch her take on the same 1890s Met combinations. There's a link to her video down below. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I am pretty happy with how they came out, and even though there's a couple things I would change on them if I made them again, which, you know, I probably will make them again in like black, because I think that would be really pretty. Overall, I'm very happy with how they came out. If you have any questions on how I made them or any questions in general, feel free to ask them in the comments down below. I do have links to all the books and websites I referenced while making my combinations listed in the description below. If you are new to my channel and you liked today's video, please consider clicking subscribe. I post or stream a new video twice a month. Also, for those of you that are interested in helping to support future projects on this channel, I have my Ko-fi page linked down below. I would like to say a huge thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my channel and for everyone that is commenting and liking my videos. It really helps them receive more recognition in the YouTube analytics, so thank you so much. So this is all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below and I will do my best to answer all of them. I hope you have a lovely day and I'll see you next time. Bye!